The night was quiet, too quiet for a man who had grown used to silence. Inside a lonely ranch house, a single lamp flickered against the wooden walls, casting shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. The old rancher sat by the table, his calloused hands wrapped around a half-empty glass, listening to the emptiness. He had spent years alone, with no one but the wind and the creak of the house for company. But tonight, the silence broke. A slow, steady knock echoed at the door. He froze, heart thudding in his chest. Nobody came out here. Nobody knocked on his door, not at this hour, not ever. The knock came again, louder this time, dragging something heavy with it. He stood, his throat dry, and as he reached for the handle, a voice whispered from the other side, soft, broken, and haunting. The rancher had lived in that house for more than 20 years, though it felt like twice as long. The land stretched wide and empty around him, nothing but dry fields, crooked fences, and a distant line of hills that held back the horizon. Once this place had carried the sound of laughter, the clatter of hooves, the busy rhythm of a life worth living. Now it was nothing but stillness. The cattle were gone. The barn leaned as if it were tired of standing, and the rancher himself carried the same weight in his shoulders. Every day followed the same pattern. He rose with the dawn, fed what few animals were left, and worked until his body ached. In the evenings, he sat at the same wooden table, staring into the same quiet. Some nights, he poured a drink. Other nights, he simply sat in the dark, listening to memories he couldn't silence. The house spoke to him in its own way. The moan of the rafters when the wind picked up, the scratching of tree branches against the glass. They reminded him he was alive, but barely. People in town had stopped asking about him long ago. He was the kind of man others whispered about, but rarely visited. A man marked by regret, though no one dared to ask what weighed on him. And through it all, he carried one truth like a shadow. He had once made a choice that could not be undone. Some nights, he swore he could hear that choice knocking at his door. But until tonight, it had only lived inside his mind. The knock came again, sharp against the wooden frame, pulling him out of his thoughts. His first instinct was to ignore it. Out here, visitors meant trouble more often than not. But something in that sound, slow, heavy, almost deliberate, made his chest tighten. He set his glass down and moved toward the door, each step dragging as if the house itself resisted his choice. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. No answer came, only the faint whistle of the wind through the cracks. He stood still, hand hovering over the handle, the silence pressing against him like a weight. Then another knock, this time softer, but closer, as though whoever stood outside was leaning against the door. His fingers trembled. It had been years since anyone sought him out, years since he'd heard another voice in this place. And yet, with every breath, a strange sense of recognition stirred inside him, like a memory he had buried deep. Against his better judgment, he pulled the latch and eased the door open just enough to see. The lantern light spilled onto the porch, catching the outline of a figure standing in the dark. A woman. Her hair hung damp against her shoulders, her dress torn at the edges, her face pale beneath the moonlight. She looked straight at him, her eyes carrying something he couldn't name, sorrow, anger, or maybe both. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice that sounded cracked from pain and distance, she whispered the words that froze his blood. "You should have left me there." The rancher's hand stayed on the doorframe, his knuckles white, as if he needed the wood to hold himself steady. The woman's words cut deeper than the cold night air. "You should have left me there." He swallowed hard, searching her face for meaning, but the more he looked, the more unsettled he became. I don't understand," he muttered, his voice unsteady. "Left you where?" Her eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as if she pitied him. Then her lips pressed tight, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. She stepped forward, and though her movements were slow, the weight of them made him take a step back. "You know where," she said softly, almost too soft to hear. "You've always known." The word struck something inside him, something he had worked years to bury. He felt his chest tighten, his throat dry. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was mistaken, but the way she stood there, half in shadow, half in the glow of his lantern, made it impossible. "Why are you here?" he asked, though part of him feared the answer. Her gaze swept over the house, the walls, the quiet corners behind him. Finally, her eyes returned to his, sharp and unflinching. "Because you opened the door," she whispered, "and because you never should have come for me that night." The rancher's heart pounded as the silence returned between them. He didn't know if she was flesh and blood, or something far older and darker. All he knew was that her presence dragged the past into the present, and there was no hiding from it now. The rancher gripped the edge of the door as if holding on to it could keep the past from rushing in. But her words had already broken the dam. Memories he had buried long ago began to rise, sharp and unrelenting. Years back, before the loneliness and the silence, he had not been alone. The land was harsh, but life had meaning because there was someone beside him. Her. He remembered the first time he saw her, standing by the creek that cut across the lower pasture. She had laughed when he offered her his hat to shield from the sun, and that laugh had stayed with him for weeks. She was not from around here, not tied to this place the way he was. But somehow she had made it home. They built something together, or at least tried. Long days of work on the ranch, nights spent talking by the fire, and in between, the kind of quiet moments that kept a man going. Yet beneath it all, there had been shadows. She carried a weight he couldn't reach, a part of her past she never spoke about. And he, in his stubborn pride, never asked enough. Then came the night everything changed. A storm had swept across the hills, flooding the creek and tearing through the fences. He remembered searching for her in the dark, calling her name until his voice gave out. He found her hours later, broken and shivering, trapped in the mud near the ravine. She had begged him not to move her, begged him to leave her there. But he couldn't. He lifted her into his arms, fighting against the rain, against her pleas. She had survived that night, but something in her had not. From then on, she grew distant, like she was living in two worlds, one with him and one far away. And then, one day, she was simply gone. No letter, no goodbye. Just gone. Now, standing in his doorway, she looked exactly as she had on that night, soaked, pale, and carrying those same words. "You should have left me there." The rancher felt the weight of guilt crush him all over again. He had saved her life, but in doing so, had he destroyed something far greater? The rancher's breath grew heavy, each inhale scraping against his chest. He wanted to believe she was real, flesh and bone standing before him. Yet the longer he looked, the more uncertain he became. Her skin was pale as moonlight. Her dress clung damp to her frame, though no rain had fallen that night. And her eyes, those eyes he once knew so well, now seemed like they belonged to someone caught between this world and another. "You're not here," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "You can't be here." She tilted her head, a faint smile flickering at the corner of her mouth. "You tell yourself that, but your heart knows better." He stepped back, the old wooden floor groaning under his boots. His chest ached with the memory of that night, of ignoring her pleas, of carrying her away when she had begged him to let her go. He had thought he'd saved her. But what if she had been right? What if leaving her there had been the kinder choice? The silence between them thickened. The air felt colder, sharper, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. He wanted to slam the door shut, to lock it and drown himself in whiskey until morning. But his hand wouldn't move. Instead, he heard his own voice break the stillness. "What do you want from me?" Her expression hardened, the sorrow giving way to something darker. "I want the truth," she said, her words low but steady. "I want you to face what you did and what you wouldn't let me do." The rancher's throat tightened as he met her gaze. Her voice, though soft, cut through him sharper than any blade. He had lived years with silence, but nothing compared to the weight of hearing her accuse him now. "I saved you," he said, the words rushing out as if he had to defend himself. "I carried you through that storm. I pulled you out of the mud when you would have drowned." His hands trembled at his sides, anger and fear tangled together. Her face didn't soften. If anything, Her eyes burned hotter. "You saved my body," she whispered, "but you killed everything else. I begged you to leave me, to let me go, but you couldn't. You needed me more than you listened to me." He shook his head, his chest pounding. "I couldn't just stand there and watch. I thought," he stopped, his voice cracking. "I thought I was doing the right thing." Tears welled in her eyes, though they never fell. "The right thing for you," she said. "Not for me." The words struck him like a blow. He staggered back, pressing a hand against the table for balance. All these years he had told himself he had been her savior, that he had done what any decent man would do. But in her eyes, he saw only betrayal. "I carried you out of that place," he whispered, more to himself now, broken. "And I've been carrying it ever since," she answered, her voice cold, final. The house fell silent again, but it wasn't the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of truth, sharp and unforgiving, leaving nowhere to hide. The rancher's chest heaved, every breath a reminder of the years he had lived with a lie. He searched her face for some trace of forgiveness, but there was none. Only the heavy shadow of the past. "You think I left you?" he said at last, voice shaking. "But I didn't. I fought for you. I brought you back here. I tried to give you life." Her eyes darkened, and for a moment the lantern light flickered as if it, too, recoiled. "You didn't give me life," she said. "You gave me years I never wanted. You kept me trapped in a body that was already finished. You couldn't let me go, not because of love, but because of guilt. You couldn't stand losing me, so you forced me to stay." The word struck him harder than any storm. He felt the room tilt, his knees nearly giving way. Deep down, he had always known this truth. The night he carried her from the ravine, he had heard her voice begging him to stop. He had ignored it, convincing himself he was strong enough to decide for both of them. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "So what are you now? A ghost? A memory come to punish me?" She stepped closer, her face inches from his. Her presence was cold, yet overwhelming. "I'm what you made me," she said. "I'm the voice you silenced. I am the weight you've carried every night since. And I won't leave until you face it." The rancher's legs trembled. For the first time, he realized he wasn't fighting her presence. He was fighting the truth that had been clawing at his soul for years. The rancher sank into the nearest chair, his strength gone, his hands shaking against his knees. He couldn't meet her eyes any longer. The truth weighed too heavy. For years, he had told himself he'd saved her, clinging to that story like a shield. But tonight the shield had shattered. Her voice softened now, almost tender. "You carried me out of that ravine, but you never set me down. You've carried me every day since. And that's why I came back. Not to punish you, but to remind you." His throat burned as he tried to speak. "Remind me of what?" "That sometimes love means letting go," she whispered. The words cut through him, not as a wound, but as release. For the first time, he felt the weight in his chest begin to ease. Slowly, he lifted his head, but she was no longer standing in the doorway. The porch was empty, the night still. Only the echo of her voice lingered in the air. He rose, walked to the door, and for a long while he stood there, staring into the darkness. Then, with a trembling hand, he pushed the door open wider, not in welcome, but in surrender. The cold night air filled the house, and the silence returned, softer now, no longer accusing. The rancher closed his eyes and whispered to the emptiness, "I hear you. I'll let you go." And for the first time in years, the silence felt like peace. This story ends here, but the silence never really goes away. In the next tale, you'll see what happens when silence turns into something far darker.